The icy winds howled across the desolate mountain peaks, where snow fell endlessly, cloaking the world in a frozen silence. It was a realm untouched by the chaos of the stars, so remote that no soul, human or otherwise, had cause to tread its treacherous slopes. Yet, fate had its strange ways of drawing paths together, and here, amid this unforgiving landscape, two worlds would collide. She stumbled, her alien form draped in garments torn by jagged rocks and the sharp sting of the frost. Her steps were slow and halting, her breathing ragged, as the air was thin and unkind. The matriarch of the Xelarian Empire, bearer of countless titles, and mother to the great alien King Varth, had become a fragile, wounded figure against the bleak white expanse. Her crystalline skin, a pale hue that shimmered like starlight, was now marred by streaks of violet blood that leaked from wounds unseen. She had not known such vulnerability in centuries. Perhaps longer. The Xelarians were beings of power, travelers of galaxies, conquerors of lesser realms. And yet, none of that strength had spared her from the fury of nature when her ship had fallen from the sky. The wreckage of the royal vessel lay scattered somewhere far below, buried beneath snow and ice. There had been no servants left to shield her. No imperial guards to rally at her side. The crash had stolen all of that, reducing her to little more than a wandering ghost. Her mind screamed at her to stop moving, to rest, but her will refused. To stop here would mean death, and her son still waited for her light to guide him across the stars. Somewhere behind her, a low rumble echoed across the cliffs, the sound carried by the wind like a distant growl. Avalanches haunted these peaks, and she dared not linger. With each step, her silvered boots sank deeper into the snow, as though the mountain itself sought to swallow her whole. She raised her face to the skies, her glowing eyes scanning the heavens where no trace of her people remained. Why? Her voice trembled, her alien tongue a melodic whisper against the cold. Why have you forsaken me? There was no answer. Hours passed, or perhaps days, it was impossible to know. Time had no meaning in this frozen abyss. Her vision began to blur, the snow dancing before her eyes in strange, hypnotic patterns. Her limbs grew heavy. Her alien heart, though powerful, began to slow, a deep ache spreading across her chest. And then, she fell. The snow cushioned her frail form as she collapsed onto the slope, unable to summon the strength to rise again. The world was quiet now, save for the wind that roared like some ancient beast. For the first time, she accepted the possibility that this mountain, this barren, mortal place, would become her tomb. But the universe was not done with her yet. At the edge of the valley below, a lone human soldier trudged forward, his heavy boots crunching against the ice-crusted earth. Sergeant Daniel Dan Hawthorne was no stranger to hardship. He had fought in countless battles, survived hellish environments on alien planets, and buried friends in places no one would ever see again. Yet this endless, snow-choked mountain range felt like an entirely different war. "Command, this is Hawthorne." "Still nothing," he growled into the communicator strapped to his chest, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped tightly over his face. Static greeted him in response. An expected companion, given the interference from the mountains. He adjusted the strap of his pack and grunted, peering up at the white peaks that seemed to go on forever. 3 days earlier, his outpost had picked up strange readings, a faint energy signal that didn't belong to any known human tech. The higher-ups suspected a crashed probe, maybe even an old alien drone. Dan had volunteered to check it out, partly because he was sick of staring at the walls of their makeshift camp. He hadn't expected to end up alone, braving a storm that seemed to want him dead. "Figures," he muttered under his breath. He was used to getting the short end of the stick. The cold bit at his skin through his thermal layers as he climbed higher. Dan knew he should turn back soon. The temperature was dropping, and he didn't have the equipment to stay out much longer. Still, something gnawed at him, an instinct he couldn't shake. There was something out here, and he couldn't leave without knowing. It was then, as he rounded a rocky outcrop, that he saw it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the snow, a strange shimmer of light reflecting off the ice. But as he crept closer, his heart leapt into his throat. A figure lay sprawled in the snow ahead, half buried by the wind-driven drifts. "Holy hell!" Dan's voice caught as he rushed forward, his gloved hands brushing away the snow to reveal the body beneath. The woman, or whatever she was, looked like something from a dream. Her skin, pale and glowing faintly, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. Her features were delicate and regal, her hair like strands of spun silver that splayed around her in the snow. Strange, torn fabrics clung to her form, dyed with a color Dan couldn't name, and streaks of violet blood stained the ground where she lay. For a split second, he froze. Every instinct told him to be cautious. He'd seen aliens before, in combat zones across the stars. Not all of them had been friendly. But then he saw her chest rise, barely, but enough to tell him she was still alive. "Hang in there," Dan murmured, pulling his pack from his shoulders and digging through it with shaking hands. He didn't know who, or what, she was, but he couldn't let her die here. Not like this. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, hoping to feel something like a pulse. It was faint, but it was there. Alive. That was all that mattered. "All right, lady," he said through gritted teeth as he hoisted her limp form into his arms. "You picked a hell of a place for a nap." The climb down was agonizing. Dan's muscles screamed under the weight of both his pack and the alien woman, but he pushed forward, 1 step at a time. He could feel the cold seeping into her body, and he muttered curses under his breath as he picked up the pace. If he didn't get her somewhere warm soon, it wouldn't matter that he'd found her alive. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached the small, abandoned shelter he'd scouted earlier, a crude cabin built into the side of the mountain, likely by some long-forgotten explorers. He kicked open the door and stumbled inside, the warmth of the small heater he'd left running washing over him like a wave. "Stay with me," he muttered, laying her carefully onto a pile of blankets near the heater. Her body was light, too light, and he couldn't shake the thought that she looked impossibly fragile. Dan grabbed his medkit and dropped to his knees beside her. He wasn't a doctor, but he'd patched up enough wounds in the field to know the basics. He worked quickly, using antiseptics and gauze to clean the gashes across her arms and torso. The violet blood stained his gloves, but he ignored it, focusing on the task at hand. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and let out a long breath. She was still alive, her breathing shallow, but steady. That was enough for now. Dan pulled a blanket over her and slumped against the wall, exhaustion washing over him. His eyes drifted to her face, and for the first time, he noticed the faint markings along her skin, patterns that glowed softly, like constellations trapped beneath her flesh. "What the hell are you?" he whispered. The woman didn't answer. She didn't even stir. But Dan knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary alien. And whatever had brought her to this mountain, whatever had caused her to crash here, was far from over. Dan barely slept that night. The cabin was quiet save for the whistle of the wind seeping through cracks in the wooden walls and the faint hum of the portable heater he'd set up near the alien woman. He watched her chest rise and fall in shallow, rhythmic breaths, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why had she been alone in such a godforsaken place? As the hours crawled by, Dan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that her presence was more significant than he realized. He'd seen plenty of aliens during the war. The galaxy was full of hostile species, governments, and empires. This woman wasn't like them, though. Even in her unconscious state, there was an air of something regal about her, like a queen displaced from her throne. It wasn't until dawn began to seep through the frost-covered window that she finally stirred. Dan had dozed off against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, when the faintest sound pulled him from his light sleep, a soft, pained groan. His eyes snapped open, and his hand instinctively reached for the sidearm holstered at his hip. The alien woman shifted beneath the blanket. Her glowing eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, as though she were waking from a dream. She blinked slowly, the strange, faint patterns along her skin pulsing in time with her breaths. Dan froze, holding his breath as her gaze turned toward him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her glowing eyes narrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing her face as she took in her surroundings, the crude cabin, the heat source, and finally him. Dan raised his hands slowly, palms up, in a universal sign of peace. "Easy there," he said softly. "You're safe." Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, she winced and clutched at her side, where the worst of her wounds were hidden beneath layers of gauze and Dan's makeshift bandaging. "Yeah, you're banged up pretty bad," he added, his voice calm but firm. You're lucky I found you when I did. I don't know if you understand me, but don't try to move. Just rest. She studied him for a long moment, her glowing gaze searching his face. There was something intense in the way she looked at him, something Dan couldn't quite place. Slowly, as though testing her strength, she spoke. Where am I? Dan blinked, surprised to hear her voice. Her words were accented, as though her tongue wasn't used to his language, but she spoke clearly enough for him to understand. You're in the mountains, he replied. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, on a planet called Earth. Her brow furrowed at that, confusion deepening across her alien features. Earth, she repeated, the word rolling awkwardly off her tongue. This is not my world. No kidding, Dan muttered, though he kept his tone light. You crash-landed up there. Ship's a wreck. You're lucky to be alive. She turned her face away, her expression unreadable. For a long while, silence stretched between them, the only sound the low hum of the heater and the wind outside. Dan didn't press her. He figured she needed time to process whatever mess she'd gotten herself into. Eventually, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. You saved me. Dan shrugged. You were half dead. I couldn't just leave you up there. You are human, she asked, looking at him again. Yeah. Name's Dan Hawthorne. Sergeant, Earth Military, though I'm on leave right now. He gave her a faint smile, hoping it would ease some of the tension. You got a name? She hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering. Then, softly, she replied, I am called Aria. Aria. Dan tested the name on his tongue. It suited her, otherworldly and elegant. Well, Aria, you're lucky Earth's got stubborn folks like me who like wandering in the snow. A faint, fleeting smile touched her lips, though it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Her gaze fell to the bandages on her arms, then to the blankets he'd wrapped around her. There was a vulnerability in her now, something Dan hadn't expected. I owe you a great debt, she said softly. Dan shook his head. Don't worry about it. Let's just focus on getting you back on your feet. Aria's expression darkened at that, her features tensing as though he'd struck some hidden nerve. No, she murmured. There is no time. Dan frowned. What do you mean? She turned her head, her glowing eyes boring into him. They will come for me. Dan's heart skipped a beat. Who? The Xelarian Empire, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that flickered across her features. I am their queen mother. My son rules over countless worlds. If they find me here, they will take me back, and burn this planet to ash to conceal my shame. Dan stared at her, stunned into silence. Queen Mother. Alien Empire. Burning the planet to ash. It was a lot to take in. You're saying, they'd destroy Earth just to find you? Yes, Aria said, her voice heavy. My son cannot know I was here, injured, vulnerable. It would be seen as weakness, and in the Xelarian Empire, weakness is death. Dan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He'd fought in wars before, but nothing like this. If what she was saying was true, Earth was in danger just because she'd crashed here. What are we supposed to do then? He asked. You can't exactly walk back up that mountain, and I don't think your ship's getting fixed anytime soon. Aria looked away, her face etched with a pain that had nothing to do with her injuries. I do not know, she admitted. But I cannot stay. Dan ran a hand through his hair, letting out a low breath. Well, you're not going anywhere until you're healed. Let's take this one step at a time. She didn't argue, though her expression remained troubled. Dan stood and moved to the window, peering out at the snow-covered world beyond. The mountains stretched as far as the eye could see, their peaks glowing orange in the light of the rising sun. Somewhere out there, Aria's enemies might already be searching for her. Dan's gut told him that whatever was coming would be bad. But he also knew one thing for sure, he wouldn't let them take her. Not after he'd fought so hard to keep her alive. We'll figure this out, he said firmly, glancing back at her. I promise. Aria's gaze met his, and for the first time, something flickered in her glowing eyes. Hope. Outside, the wind howled. The storm was far from over. The morning stretched on as Dan prepared what little food he had, freeze-dried military rations and protein bars, while Aria watched him in silence. She sat propped against the wall, swathed in blankets, her wounds beginning to heal at an unnaturally quick rate. Dan had noticed the faint shimmer under her skin, like a soft glow, whenever she moved. The alien physiology still amazed him, but he was smart enough not to pry too much. "You sure you're all right?" he asked as he handed her a cup of warm water. "You look better than you did last night." "I will heal," Aria replied, her voice low and soft. "My body repairs itself, given time." "It is our way," Dan nodded, watching as she sipped carefully from the cup. Her movements were deliberate and graceful, even in her weakened state. It was as though everything she did spoke of someone who had been raised with power, dignity, and authority. "So, Queen Mother," Dan said, trying to keep the conversation light even as his mind churned, "you want to tell me how you ended up crashing here?" Aria's expression darkened. She placed the cup down, her glowing eyes fixed on the wooden floor. There was betrayal. "My vessel was sabotaged. An attempt to rid the Empire of me." Dan whistled under his breath. "Someone tried to kill you?" "Yes," Aria said, her tone calm but edged with pain. "There are factions within the Xelarian Empire that would see me gone. I am old, as humans would say. Though I have guided my son's rule for centuries, some now whisper that I am a burden to his throne." Dan leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. "And your son doesn't know about this?" "No," she replied. "My enemies struck in secrecy. My ship fell through a rift in space, uncontrolled, lost. I never imagined it would bring me here." She looked up at him, her expression troubled. "The Empire will learn of my disappearance. If they trace my path to this planet, Earth will burn." Dan exhaled slowly, processing her words. "You keep saying that. But why? Why would they go to those lengths just to cover up your crash?" Aria hesitated. Then quietly she said, "The Xelarian Empire has thrived for eons through strength and fear. To admit that their Queen Mother, one of their most revered figures, was wounded and stranded on an insignificant world? It would shake their foundations. They would rather erase all evidence of my fall than admit such a shameful truth." Dan ran a hand down his face. "So, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place." "Yes." Silence fell between them, broken only by the wind outside and the crackle of the heater. Dan's military mind whirred as he considered their options. They were isolated out here, with no way to contact Earth's central authorities. Even if they did, what would they say? That an alien queen was hiding in the mountains, and an interstellar armada was on its way? No one would believe them until it was too late. But Dan wasn't about to sit around waiting for the worst. "All right," he said finally, pushing himself to his feet. "If they're coming, we need to get you out of here. Far away from this mountain. Far away from anyone who could get hurt." Aria's glowing eyes met his, a mixture of surprise and curiosity flickering in their depths. "You would help me?" "Of course," Dan replied, his voice firm. "I don't know much about galactic empires, but I do know this. If they find you here, it's not just you in danger, it's everyone. I can't let that happen." For a moment, Aria said nothing. Then, slowly, she inclined her head. "You are different from others I have known, Dan Hawthorne." "Yeah, well, I get that a lot," he said with a faint grin. "Come on. We've got work to do." By midday, the snowstorm had subsided, leaving the world eerily quiet. Dan helped Aria to her feet, careful to keep her steady as they prepared to leave the shelter. She was still weak, but the improvement in her condition was obvious. Her skin glowed more brightly now, the faint constellations beneath it pulsing in a rhythm Dan couldn't begin to understand. "You sure you can walk?" he asked as he tightened the straps on his pack. "I will manage," Aria replied, standing tall despite the lingering tremors in her limbs. There was a strength to her that Dan found impressive, regal, even in her most vulnerable state. Dan slung his rifle across his shoulder and opened the cabin door, letting in a blast of freezing air. The world outside was blindingly white, the snow covering every trace of their earlier tracks. For once, Dan was grateful for the storm. It would make it harder for anyone to follow them. "All right," he said, stepping outside. "Let's move." Aria followed him, her bare feet leaving faint, shimmering imprints in the snow. Dan noticed it but said nothing. If someone or something was looking for her, those prints might make their task easier, but they had no choice but to keep moving. The hours wore on as they trudged through the snow-covered landscape, Dan leading the way and Aria following close behind. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, their peaks disappearing into the gray clouds above. Every so often, Dan would glance back at her, making sure she was still keeping up. "You're doing all right back there?" "Yes," she replied, though her voice was breathless. "Your world is crueler than I imagined." Dan smirked. "You picked the worst part of it, that's for sure." The trek was grueling, but Dan knew they needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the crash site. Aria's enemies would come looking eventually, he was sure of that, and he wasn't about to let them find her without a fight. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, they reached the edge of a frozen ravine. The jagged cliffs stretched out before them, a sheer drop into darkness below. Dan scanned the area, his sharp military instincts picking up on something that made his blood run cold. "Wait," he said suddenly, holding out a hand to stop Aria. She froze, her glowing eyes narrowing as she looked at him. "What is it?" Dan crouched low, his rifle ready. "We're not alone." At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, a sound low and distant, like the hum of an engine, reached his ears. Dan's pulse quickened as he turned his gaze upward. Through the clouds above, he caught a glimpse of something massive and dark descending toward the mountains. A ship. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. "They're here." Aria's face paled, her glowing eyes wide with fear. "It is my son's fleet." Dan's mind raced. They didn't have much time. If the fleet was already here, they'd be swarming the area soon, searching for Aria. He grabbed her arm gently but firmly, pulling her toward a narrow path along the edge of the ravine. "Come on," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get out of sight." Aria followed without protest, her movements quick despite her lingering weakness. The two of them scrambled down the rocky path, the sound of the descending ship growing louder with each passing moment. Dan's heart pounded in his chest as he led her into a narrow cave at the base of the cliff. It wasn't much, but it would hide them, for now. He pulled Aria inside and crouched near the entrance, his rifle ready as he scanned the sky. Outside, the air shimmered with unnatural energy as the massive ship hovered above the mountains, casting a shadow over the snow-covered peaks. Smaller crafts began to detach from its hull, sleek and insect-like, their engines glowing faintly as they spread out across the landscape. Dan's grip tightened on his weapon. "They're looking for you." "Yes," Aria whispered, her voice trembling. "And they will not stop until they find me." Dan glanced at her, his jaw set with determination. "Then we'll just have to make sure they don't." Outside, the fleet descended like a swarm of locusts, scouring the mountains for any trace of the lost queen. But in the darkness of the cave, hidden from view, Dan and Aria sat in silence, preparing for what was to come. The fight for survival had only just begun. The cave was cold and silent, but Dan's mind was racing. Outside, the Xelarian search crafts prowled the mountains like predators, their engines casting an eerie hum across the snow-draped cliffs. Aria sat beside him, her glowing skin faintly illuminating the cave walls. "They are relentless," she whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "They will not leave until I am found." Dan turned to her, his expression resolute. "Then we make sure they don't find you." Aria blinked, startled. "How?" Dan's military instincts were already piecing a plan together. "You said they're here to cover up your fall, right? That means they want no witnesses. But that works against them." She frowned. "I do not understand. If we make it impossible for them to hide what's happening here, they'll have no choice but to retreat." He glanced at her. "Your people care about their reputation, right? Well, if Earth finds out an alien fleet is hovering above our mountains, there'll be no way to keep it quiet." Aria's eyes widened as realization dawned. "You mean to expose them?" "Exactly," Dan replied, a small grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "We just need to send out a message. Let Earth know what's going on. My people have satellites, monitoring stations. If we get a signal out, they'll pick it up. And the Xelarians? Aria asked, worry etched on her face. We'll keep them busy long enough to get the job done. She studied him for a long moment, her glowing gaze searching his face. You risk much for me, Dan Hawthorne. Dan shrugged, checking his rifle and gear. Well, it's kinda what humans do. We fight for the people who need us. Aria's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Then let us fight together. They moved quickly as night fell, slipping through the snow-covered ravines and dense forests. Dan led the way, his every movement deliberate and precise. He knew the Xelarian search crafts were circling above, but he also knew these mountains better than anyone. If they were going to get to his old military comm relay, a forgotten station a few miles east, it would be through the shadows. Stay low, he whispered as they ducked beneath the edge of a frozen ridge. Aria followed closely, her movements surprisingly quiet for someone unused to Earth's terrain. A low hum filled the air above them. Dan froze, pulling Aria into the cover of an ice-packed overhang as one of the Xelarian scout drones hovered past, its glowing sensors scanning the ground below. Close one, Dan muttered under his breath. They pressed on, pushing through the snow until finally, the dark silhouette of the old military relay station came into view. It was a rusted, decrepit structure, abandoned years ago, but its old comm system might still work if Dan could power it up. Inside, he said, motioning to Aria. The two of them slipped into the station. The interior was dark and musty, filled with abandoned consoles and half-frozen wires. Dan immediately began working, flipping open panels and rerouting power. The system groaned to life, ancient screens flickering as energy hummed through the circuits. Come on, Dan muttered, typing commands into the console. Just a little more. Aria stood nearby, her glowing eyes scanning the entrance warily. Hurry, Dan. They are close. I can feel them. The comm relay suddenly buzzed to life, and a faint green light flashed on the screen. Yes. Dan grinned triumphantly. We've got signal. He quickly punched in the emergency broadcast code, sending a transmission on all military frequencies. This is Sergeant Dan Hawthorne, Earth Military. Urgent distress call. We've got an alien fleet in Earth's atmosphere. Repeat. Xelarian Empire forces are here. Transmitting coordinates now. A sharp hum echoed outside the station. Aria's expression turned grim. They have found us. Dan grabbed his rifle and turned toward the entrance. How much longer? Your signal is transmitting, Aria said. It will reach your people soon. But the Xelarians will not wait. The ground shook as the unmistakable roar of a dropship landed nearby. Dan peered through a crack in the door and swore under his breath. A squad of armored Xelarian soldiers emerged, their tall, insectoid frames gleaming under the pale moonlight. They're coming, he said, gripping his rifle. I will face them with you, Aria said firmly, stepping beside him. Dan glanced at her, surprised. She still looked frail from her injuries, but there was fire in her eyes now, the fire of a queen. You sure about this? I am Xelarian, she replied, her voice steady. And I will not let them harm this world because of me. Dan couldn't help but grin. All right, then. Let's give them hell. The Xelarians stormed the relay station, their blasters firing as they closed in. Dan fired back with deadly precision, taking down the first wave of soldiers as they breached the entrance. Aria stood beside him, her shimmering skin glowing brighter now, the energy within her building to a blinding radiance. Cover your eyes, she shouted. Dan ducked just as Aria raised her hands, and a pulse of brilliant light erupted from her palms. The Xelarian soldiers cried out, momentarily blinded as the energy sent them reeling backward. Nice trick, Dan shouted, firing at the disoriented soldiers. More Xelarians poured into the station, but Dan and Aria held their ground. For every soldier that came at them, they pushed back harder, Dan's tactical skill and Aria's energy blasts working in perfect tandem. Amid the chaos, a faint beep echoed from the console. Signal complete. Aria called. Your people have received the message. Dan grinned through the chaos. Good. Now let's get out of here. He grabbed Aria's hand, pulling her toward the back exit. The Xelarians were still reeling, their forces disorganized, but Dan knew it wouldn't last long. They raced out into the freezing night, just as the roar of Earth's fighter jets echoed overhead. Dan looked up and whooped with relief. They got the signal. Streaks of light lit up the sky as Earth's military forces engaged the Xelarian fleet. The alien ships hesitated, their once imposing presence now met with organized resistance. The Xelarians, unwilling to risk exposing their empire to Earth's full might, began to retreat, their crafts disappearing back into the clouds. Aria stood beside Dan, watching the sky with wide, astonished eyes. Your people. They fight with such spirit. Dan grinned, breathless. Yeah, we're stubborn like that. The final Xelarian ship vanished into orbit, leaving the mountains quiet once more. Dan turned to Aria, his smile softening. Looks like you're safe now. Aria looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and admiration in her glowing gaze. No. I am safe because of you. Dan shrugged. Just doing my job. She stepped closer, placing a hand over his heart. You have given me more than my life, Dan Hawthorne. You have given me hope. For your people, for mine, and for something greater. Dan's smile widened. Well, let's just call it teamwork. Aria's skin glowed faintly as the light of dawn touched the snowy mountains. Though she would have to leave Earth soon, return to her people, to her son, Dan knew this wasn't the end. Will I see you again? He asked, his voice quieter now. Aria smiled, a soft and radiant expression. Yes. When the stars call us together again, I will find you. With that, she stepped back, her form shimmering as the last remnants of the Xelarian fleet pulled her skyward in a beam of light. Dan watched her disappear, his heart full of something he couldn't quite name. He stood alone in the snow as the sun rose over the mountains, the storm finally broken. Earth was safe, for now. And somewhere among the stars, a queen remembered the human who had saved her.